Now, I hope you'll indulge me here in the beginning of this message while I share with you a Peanuts comic strip lesson. In that particular episode, Lucy is standing in her typical defiant, arms folded, with a scowl on her face attitude. Charlie Brown comes up and he wantonly says, "Lucy, you must be more loving. This world really needs love. You have to let yourself love to make this world a better place." Well, Lucy, as she does, she spins around and she knocks Charlie to the ground. And then she screams at him, "Look, blockhead, the world I love, it's people I can't stand." How often do you find yourself feeling like that? That it's easier to love the world than the people that are in it? I'm going to urge you to steer clear of that feeling. That is the way of the devil. We hear Jesus as he prays to his Father about his disciples, that would be us, in John 17, verses 14 and 15. "I gave your word to them, and the world hated them because they don't belong in this world, just as I don't belong in this world." I'm not asking you to take them out of this world, but that you keep them safe from the evil one. You see, our challenge is to love the people all around us and those farthest from us that we can't reach. Our culture has grown to place personal feelings above most everything else. We pretty much do what we want, when we want, and if we don't feel like it, we just won't do it. This has been compounded by the politically correct nonsense of not offending someone. Now, don't misconstrue my statement here. Surely we don't want to offend someone, but for me and my house, the Lord comes first. If I speak in tongues of human beings and of angels, but I don't have love, I'm a clanging gong or a clashing cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and I know all the mysteries and everything else, and if I have such complete faith that I can move mountains, but I don't have love, I'm nothing. If I give away everything that I have and hand over my own body to feel good about what I've done, but I don't have love, I receive no benefit whatsoever. Love is patient. Love is kind. It isn't jealous. It doesn't brag. It isn't arrogant. It isn't rude. It doesn't seek its own advantage. It isn't irritable. It doesn't keep a record of complaints. It isn't happy with injustice, but it is happy with the truth. Love puts up with all things, trusts all things, hopes for all things, endures all things. Love never fails. As for prophecies, they will be brought to an end. As for tongues, they will stop. As for knowledge, it will be brought to an end. We know in part, we prophesy in part. But when the perfect comes, what is partial will be brought to an end. When I was a child, I used to speak like a child, reason like a child, and think like a child. But now that I have become a man, I put an end to childish things. Now we see a reflection in the mirror. Then we will face to face. Now I know partially, but then I will know completely in the same way that I have been completely known. Now, faith, hope, and love remain. These three things. And the greatest of these is love. The Word of God. What an awesome and beautiful chapter in the greatest book that was ever written. Though this is read at many weddings and renewal of vows that were made many, many years ago, It was not Paul's intent for its use. Paul was actually scolding the people of the church in Corinth for their abuse of their spiritual powers, their spiritual gifts. Now, since the Lord is all about love, I wanted to dig into this chapter a bit of Paul's letter to the Corinthians and see if we can't discern how love truly is the greatest of all the spiritual gifts. Now, when I read this passage and began meditating on it, I realized that, there wasn't any emphasis placed on feelings. Take a look. I saw that Paul's description of love is all about action, not emotion. So let's see what love looks like when it is lived out in the church. Much of what I'm going to share with you, I derived from an expository paper that was written by a gentleman by the name of Keith Krell. He's the senior pastor of Fourth Memorial Church in Spokane, Washington, and he also is the associate professor of biblical exposition in Spokane at the Bible Institute there, the Moody Bible Institute, which means he spends a whole lot of time digging into and explaining the Bible. Now, Paul opens up chapter 13 by mentioning 6 spiritual gifts: tongues, prophecy, knowledge, faith, giving, and martyrdom. The first 4 he mentions in the previous chapter, and the gift of giving we can read all about in chapter 12 of the book of Romans. The gift of martyrdom. Now that's a bit different. I would have never thought that a martyr, being a martyr, was a gift. But listen to the definition of martyrdom as presented by Kenneth Boa, who was president of Reflection Ministries and the Trinity House Publishers. He says, martyrdom is the ability to display an attitude of joy while suffering or even dying for the faith. Following that definition, I kind of get it. Let's get back to verse 1 in chapter 13. If I speak in tongues of human beings and of angels, but I don't have love, I'm a clanging gong or a clashing cymbal. Paul's not referring to someone who speaks eloquently, but of one with the gift of tongues. Now, in this particular case, he's talking of someone speaking a private prayer language, which, of course, you are more than welcome to do. But if you don't have love, then you're doing nothing but making a bunch of noise. Amen. Now, verses 2 and 3 mention 5 more spiritual gifts: prophecy, knowledge, faith, giving, and martyrdom, or dying for your faith. Again, having these wonderful gifts is awesome, but if they aren't expressed in love, then you truly have nothing. It's Paul's declaration that the greatest expression of spirituality is love. And Keith Krell sums up these first 3 verses like this: without love, I say nothing, I am nothing, I gain nothing. Let's notice here that Paul, while scolding the Corinthians, is doing so without trying to offend them. I hope you have your Bibles open and you can see there that Paul speaks of himself as doing these things. Before each one of the references to spiritual gifts, he says, if I. He's taking it upon himself. The Corinthians have always held Paul as a positive role model. So here, Paul's inserting himself as a negative example so as not to create offense. Yet he's creating an atmosphere by which the Corinthians are willing to listen to him. Let there be no doubt that love must be what your spiritual gift is all about. Now, hopefully you've been thinking somewhat about your gifts and your ministry within this church and your life outside these walls. Do you do what you do out of the love for another, or do you do what you do because you're obligated to? Do you serve because of the satisfaction you get from the service you provide? We should all be seeking to grow in our ability to express all that we do in a manner that is drenched in love. And Paul's telling us here that love is action, not emotion. Therefore, we need to put our hands and our feet into our love. Well, now that Paul has finished with the importance of love, he spends the next 4 verses explaining how love acts. Of course, if you look up the word love, you'll find that for the most part, love is described as a feeling, an emotion. For Paul, love is a word that can only be defined by action. Love is. Love is. It's an attitude. It's a behavior. And he wants us to know what it looks like. So he takes us verses 4 through 7 to paint 15 separate portraits of love. And in these 4 verses, Paul takes the word love and he colors it with 15 verbs. Let's begin with love as patient. Patience is generally associated with either a circumstance or another person. The Lord knows we need both. But waiting for things to happen in God's time requires a good deal of patience. But in this case, Paul is referring to having patience with one another. The King James Version of the Bible calls this long suffering. Pretty apt description. Patience has certainly been one of my weakest attributes. Many of you know that. As I grow, I recognize more fully that I sin against God and others, and God has taught me to be humble in my sinful shortcomings. I'm finding it easier every day to exercise patience with others. Loving people are willing to accept the shortcomings of others because they recognize their own. Now, patience requires a positive reaction of goodness toward the other person. We'll call that kindness. Love is kind. Don't think that because patience and kindness are tied together that we have to give the other person all they want. Sometimes love calls for a bit of tough action. From within the church, kindness may be shown as forcing an addict to go through the hell of withdrawal. At home, it may mean saying no to your child when you know that what they want is harmful or dangerous. Out in society, it may mean turning in your friend who has committed a crime. Kindness at times means that you have to hold something back in order to heal someone. After talking about these two positive attributes of love, Paul gives us 8 verbs that tell us what love isn't. Love isn't jealous, which implies displeasure in the success of someone. But true love desires the best for everyone. So what do? What's our best defense against the hardships we face? Prayer. We should pray for those whom we are envious. Our prayer for them expresses our love, pushing jealousy out of our heart, because love and jealousy cannot coexist in our hearts. Love does not brag. The Greek word for brag translates into English as windbag. If you want to love others, then shed yourself of that ego. That same root word translated into Latin becomes the word perperus, which means a braggart or a swaggerer. Do you know anyone who walks around with a swagger? I'm sure you can think of somebody. I do hope that it's not you you're thinking of. Another way of a braggart is to show off in front of a crowd. In Matthew 6:1 we read, "Be careful that you don't practice your religion in front of people to draw their attention. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. But is there a time when we can boast? Yes, you bet there is. Psalm 34, verse 2. I will glory in the Lord. Let the afflicted hear and rejoice. We are to boast about the blessings we receive from the Lord in our lives. How else are others to learn if we don't witness our own story? Be careful, though. You don't want to get caught up in boasting about your own good works. The credit, all the credit, belongs to the Lord. Amen. If you truly love others, don't let your words describe you as something better than the other. These kinds of words serve only to demean. Love is not arrogant. In this context, the term arrogant refers to a grasping for power. Arrogant people push their way into leadership, using people along the way and exempting themselves from common decency and placing themselves above the law. Arrogance is disrespectful. And God calls us to serve others and be gracious unto them. Love is not rude. Some people take pleasure in being blunt, saying that I'm only being honest and straightforward. But love doesn't talk like that. Love will hold back on some thoughts if there are ones that won't be building somebody up. Love is gracious, it is courteous, it is tactful, and it is polite. Love isn't self-seeking. It doesn't seek its own advantage. Now, this is one that we don't find much of these days. In fact, our society seemingly demands that we be self-seeking. I mean, go onto Amazon, look at all the titles of the books that you'll find there. You'll find books titled like, Looking Out for Number One, Winning Through Intimidation, and Creative Aggression. I'm here to tell you that self-absorbed people cannot love. Love is not possessive, demanding, nor is it dominating. Love listens better than it talks and is always willing to defer to others. Love isn't irritable. Love does not tend to burst out in emotion and isn't exasperated by petty annoyances. If we love, we won't let someone provoke us. Another way to explain this might be to say that love is not touchy. You know someone who's quick to take offense? That you feel like you kind of have to handle them with kid gloves? Those people know nothing of agape love. Love doesn't keep a record of complaints. Love will not write down all things that have wronged them as if it must be settled up later. Love doesn't hang on to reminders of wrongs committed. Love surely doesn't bring these issues to light at a later time. Love isn't unjust. Love finds no joy in evil of any kind. Love takes no pleasures in the mistakes or sins of someone else, because love is righteous. Now, after talking about these 8 negatives, Paul turns back to positives. And there are 5 of them. Love is happy with the truth. Truth and love kind of go together. They're inseparable, actually. Truth makes our love discriminating, and love makes our truth compassionate and forgiving. If our actions are in line with agape love, then we will welcome biblical truth. Love puts up with all things. This phrase comes from a Greek word meaning to cover something. 1 Peter 4 verse 8 tells us, above all, show sincere love to each other, because love brings about the forgiveness of many sins. To say this in a different way, love covers a multitude of sins. Love protects other people. It goes that second mile to protect another's reputation. Can you think of a story in the Bible where that played out? How about the story of Mary and Joseph? Joseph refused to speak out against Mary in public, and he had every right to do so. How often have you heard a husband humiliate his wife in public? Or maybe even a wife making disparaging remarks about her husband. You remember what your mother told you when you were a little kid? If you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. Love trusts in all things. We often find ourselves distrusting someone because of bad experiences in our past, but love believes the best about people, giving them the benefit of the doubt. Allow the evidence to be made known before you make your decision. You see, people tend to become what we believe them to be. If you treat a man as being trustworthy, he will strive to be worthy of that trust. And if you treat someone as if they're the most beautiful person in the world, they will be transformed right before your very eyes. Jesus did this kind of thing a lot. Peter was faltering, and Jesus told him, "You are the rock." To a prostitute, he said, "Your sins are forgiven." To a woman who was caught in adultery, he says, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." There is power in believing the best and not the worst about people. Love hopes for all things. This takes the trust thing a step further. Paul's not suggesting that you should ignore reality. Sometimes there just isn't any doubt to provide a benefit for. And sometimes the silver lining just isn't there. What Paul's doing is suggesting that love refuses to accept failure as being final. Love never gives up on people. You see, God is in the business of turning something bad into something very good. He can do it with you, he can do it with one of your children, and he certainly can do it with that impossible child that lives next door. Having eternal hope doesn't mean we just sit back and watch God do his thing. No. We need to actively be involved in the process as God works his perfect plan. And love endures all things. Do you know that the word endures is actually a military term? It means to hold a position at all costs. You must do whatever it takes. And in this context, love holds fast to people it loves. It perseveres and it never gives up on anyone. Love doesn't stop even in the face of rejection. Love looks beyond what is now toward the hope of what the future might bring. Did you recognize yourself anywhere along this journey this morning? You should have seen me cringing as I wrote this. This love list, however, describes God's gift of himself in his Son, Jesus Christ. The love described finds its source in God, and if we take a good look at each of the phrases, you'll see that they define a lifestyle that is way out of our reach. It is unattainable for us without Christ in our lives. So ask him to live his all-powerful love in and through us. One last thing. Love is an eternal gift. Paul discusses this in the last 6 verses of our passage. In verse 8, he mentions that love never fails, which means that it never ends. And he also mentions the temporary nature of gifts. You see, his argument here is that the spiritual gifts will be done away with one day. And in verses 9 and 10, he writes, "We know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when the perfect comes, what is partial will be brought to an end." The perfect refers to the return of Christ. It is then that our understanding will be complete and perfection will be obtained. In the next two verses, Paul gives us a couple of analogies, childhood and a mirror. With the childhood analogy, he's taking an eternal perspective, saying that there'll be a time when our spiritual gifts will no longer be necessary. And when he's speaking of the mirror, he's comparing our looking into a mirror to the relationship we'll enjoy with Jesus when we see him face to face. Let me ask you, do you like looking at pictures of your loved ones? Or would you rather be sharing time with them? That's what Paul's saying here. In the last verse, he concludes with, now faith, hope, and love remain. These three things. And the greatest of these is love. For all eternity, we will have the pleasure found in these three attributes. We'll experience the incredible love of our Father in heaven. And we'll be able to love one another with a perfect love. So how does hope fit in here? You know, in eternity, there'll be no pain, no tears, no sorrow. So why will we need hope for anything? Well, it's here where that link between hope and trust comes to fruition. In eternity, we will continue to trust in God's goodness and his providing for us. So hope will abide in us, just as faith and love do. Love is the greatest of these, because in eternity, it is love that not only covers what we experience in our relationships with each other and with God, but it covers what we experience from God himself, directly, face to face. Let us pray. Father, love is so easy, but it is so hard. You pour your love down upon us every day. If it was that easy, you wouldn't need to do that. It's a difficult concept. It's complicated. It's joyful. It's wonderful. It's amazing. We thank you for continuing your work on us, so that we can be prepared for that great day in glory when we experience perfect love.